Well, welcome to this special episode of the Akkad and Coco Report. Today, joining us, we have Swapnil Hiremath, who's a nephrologist from Ottawa, world's expert on hypertension, kidney disease, and many other things.
And former guest of the Akkad and Coco Report.
Former guest, most importantly, former guest of the Akkad and Coco Report. We also have John Tucker, who is who spends most of his time upsetting physicians on Twitter. as a side hobby, as a chemist, and works as a consultant. We have these two,
and
of course
also former guest, and I'll have links to the prior appearances on the show notes.
We of course have Dr. Akkad as well. I finally got his pronunciation right after about a year and a half. We have everyone here to discuss a really interesting episode we recorded with Dinesh Thakur. Dinesh Thakur was a whistleblower for a generic drug maker in India. And he really, and there's a book written by a journalist that came out a few months ago, kind of going through opening, opening the lid on what is fairly interesting to us, at least from the outside looking in, on how exactly generic drugs are made and how the process by which a generic drug gets to the United States. So it was a really, really interesting podcast that I hope that I'm sure you folks will enjoy. We sent the podcast to some of the experts here, Dr. Hiremath and John. So I'll start off by asking John. John, what did you think from your perspective in terms of this story of generic drugs and some of the quality control issues that were discussed in the episode?
Well, I thought it was very interesting, and I kind of had mixed feelings about it. First, I think there's just a general issue of trust, which is like very, very important, and that we need to have confidence that these things are what they're supposed to be, and that they're doing what they're supposed to do, and they're not doing what they're not supposed to do, and that we're placing a tremendous amount of trust in these companies, because you can't test it. You can't test every bottle. You can't test every shipment. It's just impossible. And so there's procedures put in place, good manufacturing processes by the FDA to ensure that these things come out the same way every time. And when you get a culture going of cutting corners, which might seem reasonable in a different society where they have a different perception of risk, perhaps because of the lower standard of living and perhaps in some cases less life expectancy and whatnot. Then you wonder I guess there's a different perspective there, and you wonder whether it's really an appropriate thing to be sending all this stuff offshore to be done.
Did the so fundamentally India, for a variety of reasons, has become one of the world's experts in terms of reverse engineering these pharmaceutical drugs, creating a generic and kind of mass producing them. And of course, it turns out that eventually the FDA started approving these drugs coming to the United States because we wanted cheaper drugs, and in order to qualify for those FDA standards, it wasn't enough for the generic drug makers to have to be able to say, hey, look, this is how we produce this active ingredient. We got to basically do phase 1 trials, right? And then these phase 1 trials show that the active ingredient, when given to X, Y, and Z human, creates this level of drug. And I think for the FDA, the threshold is 20%, correct? 20% on.
It's not a trivial process.
Okay.
If you go through an ANDA application,
right,
there's literally discussions in there of what temperature the sterilizing ovens are kept at, and how they validated the thermometers that they used to ensure that the thermometers were measuring correctly. And you can literally have 30 pages on calibration of thermometers. The FDA's requirements are quite strict. It's just that if people fabricate data, then all of that comes to naught.
Right. So the question I was getting to was, is it the case that this is some massive overregulation? Meaning, are all these FDAs mandating or qualify for a what is it saying? Abbreviated new drug application? Are all those things necessary? Meaning, you spoke very nicely about trust, and you're absolutely right. I mean, that's the fundamental issue. If you're fabricating one thing, then who knows what else you're doing. Now, to be clear, what I understand Mr. Thakur found was that there was basically these equivalent of phase 1 trials, which essentially showed that you had a certain level of drug if you consumed, X, Y, and Z of the generic drug. That a lot of those were perhaps fabricated. Is it the case, though, as a chemist? Can you speak to this idea of, well, if you have the drug, if you're able to produce the active drug, right, and you haven't done, temperature stabilization, blah blah blah, whatever the ANDA requires, what is the likelihood that you're going to get a drug that is probably reasonably equivalent to the brand name drug? Is that knowable, or is that not a knowable thing?
Well, I think the reason you put the effort in up front, and what justifies the sort of obsessive compulsive nature of the regulatory process and of good manufacturing processes, is that you're going to set this up and it's a fixed cost. And then you go and you manufacture 1 million pills, and the cost per pill for doing all that really isn't that burdensome. Okay, I mean, generic drugs are dirt cheap. You can buy Prozac for 3 cents a pill. A gumball is 50 cents. So let's be clear on how little we're paying for generic drugs. And then I think that also kind of raises the question of, do we really want 3 cent a pill Prozac, and does that incentivize the kind of behavior that was talked about in that procedure? The HatchWaxman Act, I could get off on quite a sideline on that. It changed the way we make drugs in this country. It changed the nature of the pharmaceutical industry, and I think that it achieved very few of its goals and created a lot of unintended harms.
So it's a great thing. It's a great point to come to that we will definitely want to hit. But bottom line, if as a chemist, if you can produce drug, if I can show you that, hey, look, I have this, I am able to produce this many grams of this drug, right? How much more regulation do you need? Meaning, I'm trying to get at. I understand it's a trust issue, and that's clearly something that we can't get away from. But how likely was it that the drugs that we were getting from, the ARB, angiotensin, well, whatever, the hypertensive drugs, or whatever generic drugs you're making, how likely was it that U.S. patients were getting, say, either supra or subtherapeutic levels of drug?
In the U.S., where there's not a lot of deliberate counterfeiting of drugs. In Africa, for example, we have a very different issue. In the U.S., I'm not terribly concerned. And I think the reason for that is that we've set the standards up so high that if somebody cheats and comes in 2 standard deviations below the mean, below the expectation, you're still in a range where you're not going to do a tremendous amount of harm. The FDA estimated that this carcinogen that was present in the ARBs would possibly cause 1 illness per 4,000 person years of use. So that's probably that patient, 1/40th that patient's risk of having an MI, and probably 5 times their risk of dying in an auto accident on their way to pick up the prescription. And I don't mean to be cavalier about it, but we do establish very high standards. And I think part of that is perhaps even the expectation that when people fall below it, they should still be in a safe realm.
All right. Swap. What were your thoughts? What were your initial thoughts when you heard the story? Have you first of all, have you heard the story before? You've heard pieces of the story?
I hadn't actually heard a lot about this particular details of the story, but
yeah.
I was aware, of course, of Ranbaxy's problem,
Yeah.
and of course more recent stories with the ARBs and whatnot.
What about you, Swap? What parts of the story? What was your first impression, and what parts of the story had you heard? And
yeah, so if you allow me to digress a
yes,
little
please.
bit, I'm like unlike John, I don't have any specific expertise in the chemistry or the drug industry. I'm just an opinionated nephrologist and hypertensionologist. But I trained in India and I practiced in India before coming to Canada. And in terms of generics and brand names, these two countries are dramatically different in some ways. So in India, even generics have trade names. So, amlodipine will have 15 different trade names. The generic brands, we call them brands, they have trade names. And even then, we would use certain generic brands over other generic brands. And I didn't know, this was just culturally, we would use the GSK brand, for example, or the Novartis brand more likely than the other brands. Sometimes, of course, I worked in a public hospital, so we would go to the lower brands just for cost. And there was this, especially for TB, tuberculosis, there was this reputation that, hey, you should use Wokhard or GSK and not the other brands. Again, I always thought, is this an urban myth, or is it, is it one of those things that are passed on, or is there any reality behind it? With respect to Ranbaxy, the thing that took me aback was Ranbaxy was the most reputed company in India. It was the first company which became a multinational. Indians were very proud of Ranbaxy. On a personal note, my father had shares of Ranbaxy, and in India you can buy the IPO. And so he had bought them at 10 rupees a share. And when my sister got married, that's how he could afford to pay for her marriage, because he sold off his Ranbaxy shares. It was that good. So when the story fell apart a few years ago, I did follow it very closely because of this personal interest, and it was devastating. It was shocking. But even then, in the original story, not Dinesh's podcast, he talks about when his kid was sick and he needed to use antibiotics. One of his colleagues said, don't use the Ranbaxy brand, use the the GSK brand or some other brand. And that's extremely common. That's something you see all the time in India. And now I guess it's coming back to bite us. Whereas in Canada, it is that the law is such that if I write a Diovan, the pharmacist will automatically substitute it for the generic valsartan.
Right, same thing in the US. Same
exactly.
thing in the US. It's very interesting. I mean, it goes back to what John was mentioning about the trust expectations, or the expectations in general about the quality of processes in a given country, and that's built in essentially into the reputation of the brand. At the end of the day, right? I mean, it's an assumption that things are going to be looked over more meticulously here or there. What Anish was asking is that at the end of the day, if it's a manufacturing process and you produce, how much of a difference can that possibly make? I think it's a question that remains unanswered, and will not.
I can come back to that if you want.
Yeah, go ahead.
And I would say reproducibility, because as a study chemist working in the lab, I go in and I set the reaction up, and I think I did it exactly the same way as I did it last time, and I get a completely different result. And so it's kind of the nature of organic chemistry. It got 5 degrees faster. There was a bad bottle of reagent. I was slightly less careful about keeping moisture out. It can go bad, and it can go bad in a pretty serious way. And of course, if that happens on a 100,000 gallon reactor, it's going to cost you $500,000 of stuff that you have to toss out. And so there are a lot of additional safeguards simply for that reason that are in place at a manufacturing facility relative to John Tucker working in a lab on a 1 liter scale. But I think it's about reproducibility and ensuring reproducibility in a situation where reproducibility isn't like falling off of a log.
Right. So essentially, you think it's very important, and I agree with you. I mean, I agree with you that is, even though what happened with Ranbaxy cannot be precisely quantified. I mean, at least from our conversation with Dinesh Thakur, at the end of the day, couldn't say exactly, how many of the samples were, or how far off they were from what they were supposed to be, and so forth.
Well,
But
here's
it's
a
likely.
simple one,
Go ahead. Yeah.
which is most of these things are ultimately purified by crystallization.
Okay.
And just to get it into a solid state so you can put it in the milling machine. The process of crystallization is a purifying process. You tend to leave a lot of the junk in solution. And so it will help correct a certain number of errors or minor flaws in a product. And if it's bad enough, it won't crystallize. And so, even in sort of the worst, if you imagine it's the worst possible case, and I doubt, and tried to just carry it right through the manufacturing process, if it gets bad to a certain extent, you just won't be able to carry it through the process.
Okay. So at least there's some kind of natural, at least in some natural. I mean, unless really they were not getting any crystals and they were sort of going and putting.
Of course, syrup in tablets,
right? Exactly.
Oh,
But if they weren't doing that, at least there's some natural boundary to how bad it could be.
There is a natural boundary to how bad it can be.
Okay.
It does make one feel better that, look, the PEPFAR program that we mentioned, right? That kind of was one of the inciting things to all of this. The PEPFAR program, which is the AIDS program, the U.S. aid program that allows U.S. dollars to be spent to buy generic antiretrovirals. I mean, that clearly was beneficial, right? And you had so many doctors on the ground that were using this, that were following HIV viral loads. You would think that would be something that would have been found out very quickly if all of a sudden, I mean, what Swap is talking about that was happening on the ground in India in terms of, this kind of local knowledge about, hey, we should use this and we shouldn't use that. I mean, that should have been amplified times 100 in a place where HIV is rampant and you have viral loads that you're following. So, yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure that would happen, right? Because there are so many other factors that's going on. There was resistance. You don't know if the patients are taking the drugs. With TB, for example, the DOT program came into place because the resistance is so high. And in India, the TB resistance is out of control, right? So we have not only MDR TB, there's XDR TB, and now they call it TDR TB, like totally drug-resistant TB. Why does that happen? How much of that is, you blame adherence and you blame other factors, but perhaps the amount of drug that was present was also to blame.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, that's another twist to the story that I hadn't thought of.
Well, I think if you get down, you might encounter 3% impurities or 5% impurities when the FDA standard is 0.5%. But I honestly think that by the time you get down to stuff that's less than 80, 90% pure, the physical properties of that product change in a way that it's honestly going to be difficult in most cases to get it to crystallize, and it's going to be difficult to get it into a capsule.
But what about what he was mentioning?
I'm not concerned for the most part about whether the active agent is in there in sufficient quantities. In some cases, you're probably going to have issues. You might worry about impurities and what you're being exposed to in terms of impurities, as we saw with the ARBs. And there's the drug substance, and then there's the drug product where you formulated it. And in some cases, if it's not formulated correctly, you didn't mix it with the microcellulose in the right way, you might not get full absorption. But I would say even that, for most drugs, are pretty soluble. There's things like cyclosporin, of course, are a nightmare, but
yeah. What? So well, it's a good time now. So can you? So what do you think? How do you think the John? Can you speak to the HatchWaxman Act and why? And just give us a refresher on why it came up and what you think the problems were.
Well, you know why they passed the HatchWaxman Act? What was the goal of that?
Tell us
lower price,
lower on drug.
Right.
So if you look at a graph of United States expenditures on prescription drugs, do you see an inflection point when HatchWaxman passed? There's absolutely none. It failed completely its primary goal. for the simple reason that manufacturers, when you gave away their intellectual property and allowed, generic companies to use the results of their experiments to make their copycat versions, on the market, that they simply raised the prices on the remaining drugs that they had on patent that couldn't be duplicated so that they maintained their revenue. And you turned companies that formerly competed on the basis of reputation. In the 1970s and 80s, every pharmaceutical company in the country had its own NSAID, right? They were all Me Too, and you competed on the basis of reputation. The Merck representative was my dad's best friend in the 1960s. And you turned companies that formerly competed on the basis of reputation, companies that were machines for extracting as much money out of a patent before it expired as possible. And so shortly after HatchWaxman was when we had all those terrible marketing scandals and the billion-dollar fines for misrepresentation and whatnot in the pharmaceutical industry. And we've kind of gotten through that part of it, but we still have an industry that is less than it was. And we haven't cut spending on prescription drugs.
Right.
End of rant.
Well, if I can get on my soapbox here, because I imagine for many people the natural conclusion of this story is that, listen, at least in the U.S. there's a lot more regulation to maintain the quality of the product. And you go to places like India or China, and the regulations are terrible, and then you get all these substandard products and possible poisonings and whatnot. But the most potent regulation is what you just mentioned, is the need for companies to maintain their reputation. And if you push at the same time, even in the US, if you push the narrative that, listen, at the end of the day, these are all generic drugs and they're all going to be the same. And if you institute laws that, push and you put pressure on the FDA to approve generic drugs and to treat them as if they were all the same, then this is the disaster that we're left with. Whereas in fact, if you didn't have any of this push for generic drugs, which actually, I don't know if you're familiar with that story, John, but when early on we had an episode with Mary Ruberts on the 1962 amendments of the FDA that were passed at the time when and that introduced the effectiveness component of the approval process. Whereas, before, to get FDA approved, all that a company had to do was that it was safe. And so the effectiveness component was pushed by Kefauver, and it was there even before the thalidomide story broke out, because Kefauver was interested in pushing the generic drugs on the market. So he thought that if the FDA added an effectiveness component, that eventually that would help the generic drugs, because at the end of the day, they're all the same. So I find that, sort of kind of interesting. I'm concerned that the wrong conclusions are going to get drawn, that people are going to say, no, we need more regulations, more inspections, more whatnot, when in fact there's a very natural regulatory process in the markets where companies are very, if they're really competing, if it's a really competitive market, then reputation becomes very important, as testified by what Swap was saying, that in India, people go by reputation, and they get a sense that, okay, those local companies are probably not going to have the same kind of attention to detail as the ones in the US.
But Michelle, the interesting thing is that in India, FDA approval is the gold seal of so the FDA approval is what
right. So
India wants the US FDA.
It does. I mean, of course, because compared to their own Indian FDA, then it seems better. But the point, at the end of the day, is really reputation is the key in everything. Yeah. Trust and reputation is the key, and it's the most potent
It's a great point because it's a great point because the FDA serves as this awesome it's this gold standard, but and so you kind of people turn off their thinking hats and be like, oh, the FDA approved it, so it must be good, it must be fine, and you kind of maybe you get lulled into
Right.
into false.
One aspect of the one aspect. Sorry, one last thing. One aspect of the story that we didn't cover in our conversation with Dinesh is that at the FDA, the bribes. I think, and that's in the book by Catherine Eben.
Yeah.
How many. All the bribes that the generic companies would come and just hand over to the FDA administrators to get their approval process greased up. You're familiar with that, John? Or
no, I haven't heard about that.
Oh
I hadn't
yeah,
heard about
and
that.
apparently it made the news at the time back in the
Oh.
in the 90s. It was in the news that there were several stories where FDA commissioners were getting bribed, and $1,000 bills passed here and there and so forth. Yeah.
If I can make a couple of points on the FDA thing. So when again, my sources here are all secondary. I'm not the primary source for any of these things. When the first ARB recall came, the very first Valsartan recall, which was like more than a year ago, I saw it on Twitter, and there was this pharmacist. He's a Canadian pharmacist who works near Windsor. His Twitter handle is RX Renegade. He kind of said, hey, all ARBs are going to get recalled. I'm going to stock up. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And he says, most of the ARBs are made in this factory by Huahai. So he knew about it. And I'm like, come on, this is not true. This is just one brand of Valsartan, and this cannot possibly be true. But in hindsight, he was true. And as the dominoes kept falling, it was, the Teva Valsartan and the Mylan Valsartan and the Ran Valsartan and this Valsartan, that Valsartan. And then it became Losartan and then became Irbesartan. He was proved right. He knew, that guy knew. And probably many other people in the know that many ARBs are made in that fact. But there's another paper by Brian Bird in Hypertension last month, where he's trawled the FDA website, and he shows that there are many other Valsartans and Losartans and Irbesartan that are probably made in those factories which haven't been recalled. So FDA is sort of doing it one by one. They're recalling this one, and when they test it, they're recalling the other one. Whereas, on day one, all of them come from that factory. You should just recall all of them. And that still hasn't happened. It seems like a pity, right? FDA doesn't have time or what have you, or it doesn't have the wherewithal to do it. But it seems like if it's from if it's from Huahai or from Aurobindo or whatever, then all of them should be recalled. But another thing is that even Diovan. So if again, this source is the Bloomberg article about a month ago, which went into detail about the whole how it all fell apart, the ARB thing. It seems, and I think Dinesh mentions that, is that Novartis bought some, because they were running short of Diovan. So they bought some Valsartan from Huahai and they tested it and they found that spike, that impurity, and they checked for it and they notified FDA. So if they wouldn't have checked, this would have been branded as Diovan and sold as Diovan. It seems the world's, again, this is from the pharmacist. He says that the whole world's supply of atenolol comes from one factory, including the brand name Tenormin, comes from one factory in India. Whether it's brand name or generic, it comes from that one factory, which to me is mind-blowing, right? So then the whole brand name generic thing also falls apart. You're kind of depending on people who know.
No, it's interesting that it got tested by, was it Novartis you mentioned?
Exactly.
Before they would put their name on it.
Yeah.
That gets interesting. I guess I'd like to know who came up with the clever idea that we should have our drugs all made by the lowest bidder.
Swap, did you have concerns with the ARB recall? Did you feel that the risks related to continuing to take the tainted ARB was enough to kind of counteract or be significant enough relative to the risk of course, an actual recall, which has its own risks?
Yeah, there are several points you can make here. I agree with John that if you look at the attributable risk, it's probably lower with the NDMA contamination compared to the genuine risk of high blood pressure that is there. But we have alternatives, right? So the other blood pressure lowering drugs are available. It's not that it's Valsartan or bust. You can switch Valsartan to probably telmisartan is the one which has the molecular structure which is so far apart that it cannot be contaminated. Most of the other ARBs can also be contaminated. But your point about the noise created by all this is important. We looked at, there was a poster presented at one of our Canadian conferences which looked at what physicians have been doing. And what happened initially was that valsartan was recalled, so people switched to irbesartan. I switched many of my patients to irbesartan because I did not listen to RX Renegade. And then irbesartan was recalled, and then people switched to say losartan or olmesartan. And then what happened is, because of the everyone was switching to olmesartan or candesartan, there was a back order of olmesartan, and it is just so confusing. People are still going through that, right? So some people went to ACE inhibitors, then finally.
Right. I've experienced the same, and I'm going to ACE inhibitors now when before I would have gone to an ARB from the get-go. What does that, for you as a clinician, Swap? Are you? I mean, does this trouble you? The hearing about our conversation with Dinesh, sort of more general, more globally. To me, it has really raised my awareness and my concerns long term.
Absolutely. Initially, I used to think for blood pressure, like John was saying, if the 5 milligram of amlodipine contains 4.7 milligrams of amlodipine, it's not a big deal. I'm looking at the blood pressure endpoint. If the blood pressure is not controlled, I'm going to increase the dose, or I'm going to give another drug. Does it matter if the efficacy is a little bit here or there? Because I have a measurable endpoint that I'm targeting, whether it's LDL cholesterol or systolic blood pressure. But there are two different ways to think about this, right? So it could be that you're giving a antimicrobial, in which case it's you don't have a marker to measure unless you're doing drug levels, I guess. But the other one is this whole contaminant issue, which we didn't know anything about.
Right, John. Let me ask you a question on that point. In this manufacturing process, with the errors that can be introduced, is it always going to be the case? Do you think that it's most likely going to be that you will have more ineffectiveness? I mean, less active drug, as opposed to randomly, having some batch. If you're not careful with your manufacturing process, that you may actually get more of the drug or more active. It seems to me that most of the time you'll have a less effective product. Is that?
Well, you manufacture the active pharmaceutical ingredient, and that's generally going to be some sort of a powder or solid. And then that gets put into a milling machine with, all those inactive ingredients that are on the label. And the goal being to make something that'll have good shelf life, and that when you swallow it, the pill will come apart, and the goods will dissolve, and all of that. My personal feeling as a chemist is that we worry a lot about chemicals. And we worry about chemicals in a way that's a little bit disproportionate, because the history of our collective species on this planet is not one of not being exposed to chemicals. Every time you throw a steak on the grill, if I scraped a little bit of that char off, soaked it in methylene chloride, and shot it onto an LCMS, I wouldn't see a baseline. And a lot of the peaks that I would see would be known carcinogens that, as a chemist working in lab, I need a special license to buy a bottle of. Right. Chemicals are everywhere, and we're not here because we're not exposed to carcinogens. We're here because we evolved in the presence of carcinogens, and we now live long enough to where the damage accumulates after 70 or 80 years, and we do get cancer. But the amount of exposure to these sorts of adventitious chemicals that you might encounter in a pill that it would take to significantly increase your risk over what you're exposed to from your steaks and from breathing the air and from getting in a brand new car and smelling vinyl chloride, it's kind of a reach.
No,
and I'll give you an example, which is if you take tobacco, if you were mindless enough to take tobacco, ignite it on fire, and deliberately inhale the smoke 30 or 40 times a day, you would probably you'd have a greatly increased risk of getting lung cancer. but you'd get it about 2 years earlier on average than people who never smoked.
Right. Right. No, those are very good points. My question to you, John, was in terms of the active ingredient, if you have a sloppy manufacturing process,
you won't get too much drug.
Right. You're not going to get too much drug. So it's going to be
point.
one-sided. I mean, it's always going to be on the side of less effective, you'll have the issue of the carcinogens, but in terms of, if we just focus on the question of effectiveness, it seems to be most likely that it's always going to be that you will have a less effective product, right? And so, as Swap was saying, we're going to have patients who seem to be resistant to our treatments and whatnot, and perhaps who are not responding to antibiotics more likely than the opposite.
So I would say, see, I see a system that is pretty resilient for a couple of different reasons. What is, I see two major threats. One is of impurities that are toxic. And in most cases, you're not going to get a whole lot of that. And as I've said, I think people worry about chemical carcinogenesis in a way that's a little bit unrealistic. And then the other issue is when you go to take that drug and make a drug product, you have to make it so it actually dissolves, right? And that's not the chemical synthesis. It has to dissolve so it'll cross the gut epithelial, get in the bloodstream. For most drugs, for 70 or 80% of drugs, they dissolve so readily that you can muck that process up pretty badly, and it'll probably all still dissolve and get absorbed. There are drugs, like fenofibrate, cyclosporin, that you really would worry about. But 70 or 80% of drugs, I would say, even if you mucked that process up, it wouldn't be too much of an issue.
Okay.
I don't think we have a worldwide epidemic of people taking antibiotics and being subdosed either because the drug isn't in there or because it was formulated so badly they didn't absorb it. It's possible that it happens. I suspect that 98% of the problem is stuff like this carcinogen that's going to cause disease in one person per 1,000. It's hard for me to see how you just get through the physical process of manufacturing with things being that bad unless you're deliberately making counterfeit drugs.
Swap, what did you think about the new company that has come up, some private company up in the Northeast that will test each batch of the drug for veracity? Was that interesting?
That is interesting, and they're doing that with I think they are behind the ranitidine recalls, right? Initially they said it's batches of ranitidine, and I think now they're saying the molecule itself somehow causes NDMA to be produced. I don't know. I do, in large part, I do agree with John's viewpoint that people are afraid about chemicals too much in the Western world. This whole organic, natural, holistic way of thinking is that all chemicals are bad, but chemicals are everywhere. I follow Derek Lowe, for example, who's made this point on his blog many, many times. Even, for example, and I'm being a bit of a hypocrite if I say NDMA is bad and I should switch. But on the other hand, there's good pharmacoepidemiological studies showing that, for example, there is an association of hydrochlorothiazide with skin cancer. And there seems to be some mechanism behind it as well. But when patients tell me that, I say, no, yeah, it increases. Maybe there's a small increase in skin cancer, but we know that giving hydrochlorothiazide reduces mortality. Right, it reduces heart failure, so you should still take your thiazide diuretic. There are some papers from the West, from Seattle, showing that some calcium channel blockers are associated with more breast cancer in women. But I never stopped giving calcium channel blockers, and this was not contaminant, right? This was like some drug mechanism study. So when that comes out, and I shrug it off, saying, hey, the net benefit is from taking these drugs. John's point is true that, it's the net benefit that matters. And perhaps all this distrust of chemicals, and perhaps which is worse with this distrust of drugs and generics and manufacturing, will create even worse feelings among people about, I don't want to take any drugs, which is I think the bigger problem. We know genuinely that treating blood pressure helps and taking these medications help. I'm wondering if people are going to become more distrustful of just pharma in general, which would be a pity.
I don't think it would be a terrible thing if we became more distrustful of the FDA.
I mean, if you read that Bloomberg article in some respects, which and I can send the link to you, put it in the show notes. They talk about how apparently there was an inspection of the same Huawei factory, and they saw a lot of evidence. There was rust and there was this and that, and they said, "Yeah, we'll fix it." But FDA had no power to make changes, and these reports, they are buried somewhere, right? No one takes action. Like apparently there were 2 inspections where things were highlighted, were picked up, but nothing happened until Novartis reported it.
So, Swap, you have your pulse both on the American sort of medical community and the Canadian one. What do you have a sense that what's the reaction in Canada to this story or these concerns compared to what it is in the US? Any difference that you can tell or not?
Maybe a little bit less than the US, but we are still, despite our claims, the US has a huge influence on Canada. We mostly do, we claim to be different, but the differences are really very, very minor. There is a joke that when Canada was formed, they wanted to have, I think it goes like, we wanted to have a French culture, an American economy, and a British government, but we ended up with American culture, British economy, meaning something that's slow, and a French government, which is still true. So despite our claims, that we are different, it's very much. And Health Canada doesn't actually do anything, which is our equivalent. Health Canada does exactly. It's one day after FDA says something, Health Canada says the same thing.
Right. Now, your access to brand name drugs. Now, as you said, it was a very interesting point that it may be moot because at the end of the day, maybe they're all manufactured by the same plants. But do you have access to brand name drugs? I know that drugs are not covered by the Canadian healthcare system. Is that right?
Absolutely right. So drugs are not covered until the age of 65. After 65, most drugs are covered. Again, for some drugs, expensive drugs, we need to go through some paperwork. Under 65 years of age, drugs are not covered unless someone has extra insurance. So, for example, my employer does have a drug coverage, so I get them through that with a deductible and all that. If I want to prescribe Diovan, then I have to say Diovan do not substitute specifically, and most of us don't do that. And again, this will only be covered if the patient has an insurance program. Otherwise, they will have to pay the extra money, right? Because there's a huge difference between the generic and the brand name. Right. So most people end up not doing that.
So in that sense, I think it's not much different from the US situation. John, what are your thoughts? I mean, Dinesh mentioned at the end that he thought that there's a movement towards the repatriation of pharma industry back into the US.
I haven't heard much about that. I think that currently the world's biggest employer of medicinal chemists is Wuxi Pharma in Shanghai.
Right.
Manufacturing, I don't know. Yeah. I mean, it's not something I've heard a great deal about. Yeah. I think again, we have all these questions about, sterile injectables that become unavailable because nobody really wants to make sterile saline for injection for 50 cents a liter.
Right.
And these quality problems, and maybe there is, a point at which we need to kind of revisit where we're having our, drugs made and the national security aspects of that, and the incentives that we've set up for people to do things at the lowest possible price.
Well, that sounds, it's funny because on the one hand, we feel we get a sense that it's probably not a huge public health threat, right? But at the same time, I think I'm very moved by wanting better solutions, right? And wanting things to.
Well, I agree. I don't see a huge problem at this point, but there's a lot of ramifications to it. We have, for example, kind of an iffy relationship with China,
right?
Particularly, with President Trump doing the trade war thing. And what happens if they decide they're just going to stop sending us pharmaceuticals? There's there's national security. There's all kinds of implications to it, and I think that the generic experiment has been a failure. I don't think it's a reversible failure entirely, but again, if you look at sterile saline for an injection and all the drug shortages and the quality problems and stuff, having your drugs made by the cheapest bidder probably wasn't a brilliant idea.
Right, definitely, and I think if there's a revival of interest in private company, the reputation of private companies and those notions, which I think are essential, for a good market economy, then I think, maybe some good can come out of this. That people will say, hey, listen, it matters, and reputations matter, and maybe this company in the Northwest that Anish was just talking about, this Valisure, I think is the name, and perhaps we'll have an episode with them if they're willing to come and talk to us.
I think
that's yet another way, another sort of private enterprise way of supplying. I know that there's a company that does that had been doing this for supplements and probiotics and whatnot. Mm-hmm. There's a company that does that, and I think it's a great idea, and so maybe that's also
we can set one up, Michelle. All we need is an LCMS.
Let's do it. Can we put the Acar and Coca brand on it?
We can do that.
Great, guys. Anything else to wrap up? Any final thoughts, Swap?
We need to go forwards. I'm not comfortable, like you. I'm not comfortable with the status quo. Right? It was eye-opening for me to see the whole thing. What was most disconcerting is that I thought I knew what I was giving. I thought, if there is a Teva brand, Teva is based in Israel, so the drug is being made in Israel. It seems that they're just putting that label on it, and it's getting, the API is being manufactured somewhere else. And as I've been saying throughout, all the information I've got is from secondary sources. It's from Twitter, it's from hearsay, it's from the media sometimes. I think the media has not done a bad job, though eventually it took some time to get to it. Officially from FDA or from Health Canada or somewhere, they have not given us the full extent of the story, which they probably know. I'm sure they know, people in FDA know about this. So the whole thing has, like Anish said, my trust in these systems has taken a bit of a beating for good reasons. I think it's in some ways it's a good development.
It's not that difficult to implement something. When I buy chemicals to use in the lab and pour into a flask, it comes with a certificate of analysis, and it's assigned. So an individual signed it, and it's got an LCMS trace, and it's got identity and purity, and I paid $5 for it.
There's a business plan for somebody.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very good. Well, gentlemen, that was a real pleasure. Anish, do you have anything else to say here?
No, thanks so much for coming on. It's really, really fascinating and eye-opening.
Okay. And we'll put links to, everybody should follow the two of you. John and Swap will put links to your Twitter handles for listeners to follow. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.